the migrant should change their changeable features and region.
Solution, yeah.
Or you can speak it fluently.
The solution
Spectrum should always be a piece of compromise. Is that compromising?
I'll just make a comment in regards to your solution and this thing about allegiance. I'm just wondering, when you migrate to another place, you're already in a flux of movement, you are moving. And whoever is already living that place where you're going to is in a more static position because they may not have gone through this process of living, of wonder, of change. So would you suggest any way in which we could maybe converse from someone that is already fluid, that's coming to a place, and from the ones who are already there, that is not exactly in the same vibe, how this conversation could happen?
I think at the moment there's a sense of polarization, and I think partly, as Malou says, that the problem is when you attack, or somebody feels attacked, their natural instinct is to fight back. But it's not to do, as Aaron says, it's not you're not fighting back because you are being Jewish is intrinsic part of you. It's an aspect of you. But if you feel threatened, you immediately respond, but it's a political response. But it's a very difficult thing to the problem is sometimes the people who come from abroad, migrants, don't help themselves in terms of not fully trying to integrate into the society that they've just come into. But at the same time, there is also how you are welcomed or not from the host nation. Now it's very difficult to know what the balance, how you can reconcile these two. I don't really know, but I think for that to actually happen, we need to move away from this, this myth of a identity premised upon, or a fixed identity premised upon your nationhood or your ethnicity. Because, as I said again, if you look at any country over a period of a couple of 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, you will realize how dramatically the composition of the people, the language, the culture has changed. And it's through migration, through conquest, so many things. There is no such thing as pure. But it helps people feel comfortable if they can belong to a group. And I think the problem at the moment is a lot of people feel precarious. They, economically especially, I think unless the question of economic situation of people is addressed, you can't simply educate people to be welcoming. It has to go hand in hand with feeling less threatened. If you are economically threatened, then immediately you view people who are coming from abroad as the sort of people who will take over your jobs. But also, if too many people come at the same time, and you almost feel you no longer know where you where you are. That somehow the space you call home has been invaded. So, it's striking a balance is not an easy thing. But simply education is not enough. The economic situation is also very important. I mean, take the victory of Trump, for example. A lot of educated, in inverted commas, and people who have middle-class incomes voted for him. Why did they vote for him?
Well, then I would ask, what education is that? An education that doesn't form people enough to make this differentiation. I think it's a failed education. So maybe there's a sense of maybe building something much more wider than what the schools are providing nowadays for people to understand each other. I think education has at least from my perspective, education has a strong responsibility with this kind of tensions that are happening at the moment, but not an education, a failed education that doesn't address these kind of things. And I think that it would be one task of education to address the complexity that you are living now and providing with the students enough tools to make informed decisions that are inclusive of all members of the society. And I think in a certain way education is failing to do that.
Well, okay, take the example of some of the most affluent countries and well-educated people, the Scandinavians, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Holland. They are affluent. And most of their, well, I'm not going to say most, but they are pretty well educated and supposedly liberal. But you will find, even in those countries, extreme racism, because they feel their culture is being invaded. And that's something difficult to fight against, because again people are so entrenched in this belief that I am Danish, I am Norwegian. As I said, go back a few hundred years, Norway was a Danish colony.
If I may make a link to what you're saying here, and on page 2 of your paper you say, in the first full paragraph, I am a composite of British and Pakistani, and of all of the other things which are in constant flux. Links a little bit to, well, in many ways, to what I was saying about the inside and the outside, and how it, for the inside outsider, there's a degree of fluidity. It also links to what Paul is saying in his paper on, don't want everyone to go and digging for the paper, but on page 391 of his paper, he talks about the myth of origins and nationalism on page 391. And it ends the paragraph where it talks about that and says, it may make it harder for a more subtle and complex sense of identity to find appropriate expression. So the idea of being a composite, of being an inside-outsider, being in a state of flux, and this idea that there is the suggestion here of a possibility of a subtle and complex sense of identity to take hold, or to be given appropriate expression. No, I was just going to say, do you think that could be a goal of education in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think as soon as you say this is essentially your identity, whatever, whether you classify as religious, ethnic, etc., you sort of prevent these subtleties which exist from actually living on an equal footing.
Well, it's a univocity, to use, I think I'm saying that right, to use Arendt's, or the Qasir's rather, her kind of characterization of Arendt's thinking. the idea that I think one of the something that we discussed at our table, one of the difficulties of values and the transference of values is it can, and certainly in Britain is leading to a certain univocity or a movement towards this is the way you should, this is what you should be. It's always in danger, if not expressing that sentiment, but then being interpreted as expressing that sentiment. So I just wonder whether there's something about one's sense of identity that can form the basis for education, for us to have an education about ourselves that uses ourselves as the subject of the education.
I mean, what Malouf calls for, and I agree with him, is it's somehow you slowly wean people off the idea of fixed identity towards maybe accepting the multiplicity of who they are rather than having a particular allegiance. And I think the only allegiance he wishes to eventually, as a goal, is the identity of us, of a human identity. And I mean, that's the goal that I would like to see. But I think the problem lies with a lot of people who pervert the sense of what identity is and perpetuate myths. And it's very difficult to fight against these myths when people feel threatened. Their way of life feels threatened. And that's the problem.
On page 391 of Paul's article, Explicit Difference, in the third paragraph, if you don't have it, you read it later. He says that the desire for homogeneity then becomes a sort of nostalgia, the desire for a lost home, a myth of origins. This in turn runs the risk of something like a further twist to the colonization. So I think what Paul mentions here is pretty much relevant to what you just mentioned. But you also said in our group discussion, your position is more probably radical than what Jay mentions about inside-outsider. Because in Qasir? In Qasir's case, he said in our group discussion, he even don't consider himself as an insider. So this distinction between inside and outside doesn't apply to him.
That's I imagine in part because of your appearance. Yeah. You just cannot look like many white British people will think is British, and you mentioned that in your paper. Yeah. Whereas I don't have that problem.
I mean, isn't that a kind of fixation, though? And it's not it's obviously, you call it a myth, and I understand that you mean thinking of identity, thinking of a fixed identity is a myth, but by using that term myth, I think we're failing to recognize the fact that other people recognize you as having a fixed identity. Other people recognize you as brown, and that comes with a sort of fixation, which I think needs to be open for discussion. And I wanted to kind of push you a bit on your solution, where you mentioned that you would provide compulsory classes on cultural values. And to me, that sounded very much like the kind of thing that Cameron, the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, tried to do. He introduced into the curriculum that we have to teach British values. And he did this on the basis of a speech that he gave, I believe. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but where he said that the reason why we have a problem with radicalization in the UK is because we don't have a strong sense of national identity. So what we need to do is we need to teach British values to these migrants. And I mean, and I assume you would have a problem with that. That's problematic.
I have a huge problem with that.
So how is your solution
Well,
different in that sense. then?
okay, what I mean is, I think there is definitely a problem of some migrants not wishing to integrate, and I see that as a problem. You know, when in Rome, do as the Romans. You know, if somebody has been kind enough to you to invite you into their own home, you know, don't go and kick up a fuss. And sometimes I come across people like that, and I think to myself, shame on you, you know, because they don't fully understand the hospitality. But at the same time, there are people, good God, I saw one person, and you know, the Calais thing, and Britain eventually let in a few kids, and they were sent to some little place in Devon for a short period of time, and they were asking this chap, what do you think of it? And he was so angry. He said, kick them out, send them back. You know, he was so angry. Obviously, he's got some issues, you know, personal issues. So it's striking a balance where you respect the other. And some people don't do that. You know, as I said, if you welcome people with open arms and don't force assimilation upon them, then there is some likelihood that if people are the migrants who are coming and don't feel threatened, they will be more amenable. But at the same time, if migrants go into a new country and start imposing demands upon the host nation also, then they have every right to say, get out. If you don't like it, why are you here?
I don't agree, but
That's fine. That's fine.
bedrock and
That's right. The spade has turned. Okay. That's fine.
Because it's 6 o'clock,
That's
shall we
fine.
stop here? And thank you very much.
Thank you.